How?
Miss.
How?
I think it's one of the greatest horror movies ever made, if not one of the greatest movies ever.
Pulp Fiction saved John Travolta's career, and the first thing he wanted to do with that second chance was make Battlefield Earth. This was his dream project, an adaptation of L. Ron Hubbard's sci-fi novel. Travolta took it to every major studio in Hollywood. MGM said no, Fox said no, Warner Brothers said no. Nobody wanted anything to do with a massive Scientology-connected space opera. Then Travolta found Ely Samaha. He was an interesting guy. He'd made his money in nightclubs and dry cleaning, and he'd started a company called Franchise Pictures that would finance the movies the real studios wouldn't make. Sounded like a great opportunity for Travolta. What Travolta didn't know was that Samaha was running a fraud. He had worked out a deal with some German investors who'd cover almost half the budget on his films. What he was doing was telling them the movies cost way more than they actually did and keeping the difference. Battlefield Earth cost about $44 million to shoot. Samaha told investors it cost $75 million. That's $30 million that went into someone's pocket. The movie came out in May 2000 and people hated it immediately. It dropped 66% in its second weekend, then dropped another 73% after that. Theaters started pulling it. When it was all over, it had made under $30 million against a reported budget of over $90 million, including marketing. It was one of the most expensive bombs in film history. Roger Ebert said it wasn't just bad, it was hostile. The Washington Post said 1,000,000 monkeys with 1,000,000 crayons couldn't have made something this terrible. The screenwriter wrote a public apology in the newspaper, but Tarantino loved it. He actually went to the premiere and sat with the director. When the credits rolled, he hugged Roger Christian and said, "This is what I want to write." Then he told Christian, "You're going to be killed over this, but I loved it. Give it 10 or 12 years and people will come around." But as we all know now, they never did. The first Joker made $1 billion on a $65 million budget. So of course, Warner Brothers wanted a sequel badly. Todd Phillips and Joaquin Phoenix both said they weren't interested at first. But Warner kept pushing and eventually they came back with an offer. $20 million each and total creative freedom. Phillips took that freedom and ran with it. He didn't want anything to do with the DC universe while he was making this. Warner suggested shooting in London to save money. Phillips insisted on LA and kept the full budget. The studio wanted test screenings to see how audiences would react. Phillips said no. The very first time people saw the finished movie was at the Venice Film Festival, and it sucked. It opened in America to $37 million, which was less than half what the first one made, even though this one cost 3 times as much. It got a D cinema score, first time any comic book movie had ever gotten a D. The second weekend, it collapsed 81%. Warner panicked and rushed it to streaming in just 3 weeks. A lot of people thought Phillips had done this on purpose. The ending has Arthur giving up the Joker persona and getting murdered by some random guy who's implied to be the real Joker. Critics called it a $200 million punchline. Warner lost around $140 million on this thing, and Tarantino thought the whole situation was hilarious. He actually compared it to Natural Born Killers, which he wrote, "That's the natural born killers I would have dreamed of seeing as the guy who created Mickey and Mallory. I loved what they did with it. I loved the direction he took. The whole movie was the fever dream of Mickey Knox." By 2000, the Friday the 13th franchise had a problem. They'd been trying to make Freddy vs. Jason for years, and it kept falling apart. 18 different screenplays, none of them going anywhere. But they needed to keep Jason in the public eye somehow. So they asked themselves, where haven't we sent him yet? He'd been to Manhattan. He'd literally been to hell. So apparently the only place left was space. Todd Farmer came in with a pitch. Jason on a spaceship, basically Alien but with a hockey mask. The studio liked it enough to give him $14 million, which was decent money for a slasher movie but not much for science fiction. They shot it fast in Toronto with plans to release it in 2000. Then the executive who'd backed the project left the company. New Line's new leadership was focused on Lord of the Rings and didn't give a shit about a 10th Friday the 13th movie. They put it on a shelf and just left it there for 2 years. It actually premiered in Spain in late 2001 while American audiences still couldn't see it. But bootleg copies had started showing up online pretty fast. So by the time it finally opened in US theaters in April 2002, people had been talking about how bad it was for years. It opened to 6 million and ended up making less than 17 million worldwide. Lowest grossing movie in the entire franchise. But there's one scene that people remember. Jason grabs a woman, shoves her face into liquid nitrogen, freezes it solid, then smashes it against a counter. Mythbusters actually tested whether that would work. Tarantino ranked it as the second greatest death scene in the history of cinema. Everyone involved in The Lone Ranger knew the budget was out of control. They actually shut down production in August 2011 because the numbers were so alarming, right after Cowboys and Aliens had just bombed. So director Gore Verbinski, producer Jerry Bruckheimer, Johnny Depp, and Armie Hammer all agreed to defer 20% of their salaries to get the movie back on track. They reworked the budget down to $215 million. It didn't matter. By the time they finished, they'd blown past $250 anyway. Disney had convinced themselves they were making the next Pirates of the Caribbean. Same director, same producer, same star, and heavy makeup playing an eccentric sidekick. The formula had worked before. Why wouldn't it work again? It opened 4th of July weekend 2013, and Despicable Me 2 destroyed it. The Lone Ranger made $49 million over 5 days. Despicable Me made $143. And here's the thing that must have killed Disney. Despicable Me cost $76 million to make, about a third of what they'd spent on The Lone Ranger. It made 3 times as much money. The New York Times figured The Lone Ranger needed $650 million to break even. It made $260 total. Disney wrote off up to $190 million in losses. They ended their long-term relationship with Jerry Bruckheimer after that. And yet Tarantino put it on his top 10 list of the year. He wasn't defending the whole thing. Said the first 45 minutes are excellent, then there's a middle section that drags because they split the villains into 2 groups and spend hours explaining it when nobody cares. But then comes the train sequence at the end, and Tarantino called it incredible. Gus Van Sant had been trying to sell this idea since 1988. Take Hitchcock's Psycho, one of the most famous films ever made, and reshoot it frame by frame. Same script, same angles, same editing, same music, just in color with new actors. Universal kept saying no. The idea was too pointless. Why would anyone want to watch a shot-for-shot copy of a masterpiece? Then Good Will Hunting came out and Van Sant got an Oscar nomination. Suddenly, he had real leverage in Hollywood. He could have done anything. He used all of it on Psycho. Van Sant was running an experiment and he was pretty open about it. The question was simple. If you duplicate a masterpiece exactly, do you duplicate the results? Can you recreate success by copying every element that made something work? When it hit theaters in December 1998, critics treated it like desecration. It made $37 million. The original, back in 1960, had cost $807,000 and made $50 million. Van Sant wasn't particularly bothered. He basically said so it didn't work, but that was the whole point of the experiment. Tarantino actually prefers Van Sant's version to the original. In fact, he likes every remake of Psycho better than Hitchcock's original. He actually thinks Hitchcock is overrated. He said Hitchcock's 1950s movies have the stink of the 50s, and Van Sant's version, whatever its problems, doesn't have that stink. Ryan Reynolds has built an entire second career out of making fun of Green Lantern. In the Deadpool movies, he mocks it constantly. There's a scene where his character literally goes back in time to shoot himself for agreeing to make it. But when the movie was being made, it wasn't funny at all. Reynolds described the production as the classic studio nightmare. The director, Martin Campbell, hadn't even wanted Reynolds in the role. He got overruled by Warner Brothers. There was no one at the studio with a vision for what this DC universe was supposed to be. The script went through so many rewrites, nobody knew who wrote what. The budget kept climbing while nobody was watching the story. It opened to $53 million but dropped fast. Final total was just $219 million on a $200 million budget. They also spent another $75 to $100 million in marketing. Warner lost at least $75 million. The sequel they'd been planning was dead. The whole DC universe they wanted to launch got scrapped. Reynolds said afterward the film made him pretty much unhireable for a while. Tarantino puts out a list every year ranking his favorite films from the previous year. In January 2012, Green Lantern made his liked category. That same year, Drive, which critics loved, landed in his nice try tier below Green Lantern.